My name is Sarah Chen, and I'm 32 years old. I never thought a simple photograph could unravel everything. I believed about my childhood until last Thursday, when I found myself staring at an image that made my blood run cold. The discovery happened while cleaning out my late grandmother's attic, sorting through decades of memories, tucked away in dusty boxes and forgotten corners. The photograph was wedged between the pages of an old photo album, yellowed with age and slightly torn. At the edges, at first glance, it seemed innocent enough, a typical family portrait from 1998 when I was 7 years old. There I was, standing between my parents in our backyard, wearing that ridiculous polka dot dress my mother insisted I put on for pictures. My father's hand rested on my shoulder, his smile broad and genuine, while my mother stood slightly apart, her expression more reserved but still warm. But as I studied the image more closely, something felt wrong. It wasn't immediately obvious, more like a nagging sensation in the back of my mind. The kind of feeling you get when you know someone is watching you but can't quite place where they are. I held the photograph closer to the dusty attic light, squinting at the details I had somehow missed in all the family albums I'd seen growing up. That's when I noticed it in the background, barely visible through the sliding glass door that led into our kitchen, was a figure, a shadow of a person standing motionless, watching us from inside the house. The image was too blurry to make out facial features, but the silhouette was unmistakably human, and something about the posture suggested they had been there for some time. Observing our family moment from the shadows dot, my hands began to tremble as memories I had long suppressed started surfacing. I remembered that day clearly now, the way my mother kept glancing nervously toward the house, how my father seemed unusually tense despite his smile, and most disturbing of all, how I had felt an inexplicable sense of dread that I couldn't understand at 7 years old. The sensation of being watched had been so strong that I had nightmares for weeks afterward, dreams of dark figures lurking in doorways and windows. I called my mother immediately, my voice shaking as I described what I found. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, so extended that I thought the call had dropped. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, and I could hear the weight of years of carefully guarded secrets in those few words. She told me to come over right away, that there were things about our family that I needed to know, things she had hoped I would never have to learn. The drive to her house felt endless, my mind racing with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. What had my parents been hiding from me all these years? Who was that figure in the photograph, and why did their presence fill me with such overwhelming dread? As I pulled into my mother's driveway, I noticed her curtains were drawn tight despite it being mid-afternoon. She answered the door before I could knock, her face pale and drawn, looking older than I had ever seen her. Without a word, she led me to the living room where she had already prepared tea. Though her hands shook too much to pour it properly, the silence stretched between us as my mother struggled to find words. That had been locked away for over 2 decades. I watched her hands tremble as she finally began to speak, her voice carrying the weight of secrets that had shaped my entire childhood without my knowledge. She told me that the figure in the photograph was someone who had been living in our house for months, without my father or me knowing, someone she had been too terrified to confront or report to the police. It started, she explained, with small things going missing. Food from the refrigerator, clean clothes disappearing from the laundry room, subtle signs that someone else was sharing our space. At first, she thought she was losing her mind, doubting her own memory and wondering if the stress of raising a young child was affecting her perception of reality. But then she began finding evidence that couldn't be dismissed: muddy footprints in the basement, the faint smell of cigarette smoke in rooms where no one our family smoked, And most disturbing of all, the unmistakable sound of someone moving. Around the house late at night, my mother had discovered the truth by accident one evening when she went to check on me in my bedroom. She found my window slightly open, which was strange because she always kept it locked. As she moved too close, she heard a soft thud from somewhere in the walls. That's when she realized our house had become home to an uninvited guest who had been using the crawl spaces in hidden areas to move around undetected. Watching our family's daily routines and learning our patterns, the intruder had been living. In the space between the walls and in the unused portion of our basement, creating a makeshift living area that my parents discovered only after setting up hidden cameras throughout the house. The footage they captured was horrifying hours of video showing a middle-aged man emerging from his hiding spots after we went to bed, eating our food, using our bathroom, and most chillingly, standing in my bedroom doorway for long periods. Simply watching me sleep, my mother broke down as she described the panic and helplessness they felt upon making this discovery. They couldn't immediately call the police because the man seemed to know their schedules intimately and had demonstrated an uncanny ability to disappear whenever anyone else was around. They worried that confronting him directly might put me in danger, so they began the delicate process of gathering evidence while pretending that everything was normal. The photograph I had found was taken during this terrifying period when my parents were living in constant fear but trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy for my sake. The figure in the background wasn't supposed to be visible in the image, but the camera had captured what my parents had hoped to keep hidden, proof that someone was always watching, always there, turning our family home into a prison where we were the unwilling subjects of a disturbed individual's obsession. What made the situation even more disturbing was that this man seemed to know intimate details about our lives that went beyond simple observation. He left subtle signs of his presence that only my parents would recognize: family photographs rearranged slightly, personal items moved to different locations, and once, most unnervingly, a drawing I had made at school placed on my father's pillow with a note written in childish handwriting that wasn't mine. The revelation about our unwanted house guest explained so many childhood memories that had never made sense to me. I remember countless nights waking up with the unsettling feeling that someone had been in my room, the way shadows seemed to move in corners when they should have been still, and the persistent nightmares about a man watching me from dark places. What I had dismissed as childhood imagination was actually my subconscious mind picking up on very real danger. My mother continued her horrifying account, describing how she and my father had spent weeks documenting the intruder's patterns while living in constant fear. They discovered that he had somehow gained access to our house through a forgotten maintenance entrance in the basement that connected to the utility tunnels beneath our neighborhood. He had been homeless for months before finding our house, and our comfortable suburban home had become his twisted version of the perfect family life he felt he deserved to be part of. The psychological toll on my parents during this period was devastating. They couldn't sleep properly, couldn't leave me alone even for short periods, and had to maintain a facade of normalcy while planning how to safely remove this threat from our lives. My father had wanted to confront the man directly, but my mother convinced him that the unpredictable nature of someone capable of such behavior made any direct confrontation potentially dangerous for our entire family. They finally decided to act when they discovered that the intruder had been taking photographs of me while I slept. Hidden cameras they had installed caught him entering my room with an old Polaroid camera, carefully positioning himself to capture images without waking me. The violation felt so profound that my parents knew they could no longer wait for the perfect moment to involve law enforcement. Every day they delayed put me at greater risk. The plan they devised was both clever and terrifying. They would pretend to go away for a weekend family trip, but instead of leaving, my father would hide in the house while my mother and I went to stay with my grandmother. The goal was to catch the intruder in the act and have irrefutable evidence for the police while ensuring that I was safely away from whatever confrontation might occur. What happened that weekend became a story my parents never shared with me until now. And as my mother recounted the events, I understood why they had carried this secret for so many years. When my father confronted the man, the situation escalated in ways they had never anticipated. The intruder didn't flee or surrender as they had hoped. Instead, he revealed a level of obsession with our family that went far beyond simple trespassing. He had been documenting our lives in disturbing detail, keeping journals about our daily routines, our conversations, even my childhood development milestones. He had convinced himself that he was somehow part of our family, that his presence was not only welcome, but necessary for our well-being. In his delusional mind, he had become the guardian who watched over us while we slept, the protector who ensured our safety from other potential threats. The confrontation lasted hours, with my father trying to keep the situation from escalating while waiting for police backup. During this time, the intruder revealed details about our family that no outsider should have known, demonstrating just how thoroughly he had invaded our privacy and our sense of security. The police arrived to find a scene that would haunt the responding officers for years. The intruder had created an elaborate shrine in our basement, complete with hundreds of photographs of our family, detailed schedules of our daily activities, and disturbing artwork depicting himself as part of our household. What made the discovery even more chilling was the evidence that he had been planning to make his presence in our lives permanent in ways that my parents could barely bring themselves to describe. Among his possessions, officers found detailed plans for renovating our basement into a more comfortable living space, as if he intended to make our house his permanent home with or without our consent. He had been studying the structure of our house, learning about electrical systems and plumbing, apparently preparing to make modifications that would allow him to live there indefinitely while maintaining the illusion that our family was unaware of his presence. The psychological evaluation that followed his arrest revealed a deeply disturbed individual who had been living with untreated mental illness for years. He had a history of similar incidents in other cities, a pattern of selecting families that matched his idealized vision of domestic happiness, and then inserting himself into their lives through increasingly invasive methods. Our family had simply been his most successful infiltration, the longest period he had managed to sustain his delusional integration into someone else's life. What disturbed my parents most was learning that we hadn't been his first victims. The investigator assigned to our case discovered that he had targeted at least 4 other families over the previous decade, with each incident escalating in duration and intensity. In some cases, families had moved away without ever realizing they had been living with an unwanted resident, attributing strange occurrences to ordinary explanations and never connecting the dots to recognize the true source of their unease. Legal proceedings that followed were complicated by the unusual nature of the crimes and the psychological state of the perpetrator. My parents faced the difficult decision of whether to pursue charges that would require them to testify in detail about the invasion of our privacy, potentially exposing me to media attention and forcing our family to relive the trauma in a public forum. They ultimately decided to cooperate fully with the prosecution, understanding that their testimony might prevent other families from experiencing similar violations. The trial revealed the full extent of his surveillance and documentation, painting a picture of obsessive behavior that went far beyond simple trespassing or burglary. He had been living a parallel life within our walls, experiencing a twisted version of family intimacy that satisfied some deep psychological need while terrorizing us in ways we couldn't fully comprehend at the time. During the trial, my parents learned details about his methods that explained many of the strange occurrences I had experienced as a child. The cold spots I sometimes felt in my bedroom were caused by him hiding in the crawl space above my ceiling. The dreams about being watched weren't dreams at all, but half-conscious awareness of his actual presence in my room during the night. The sentence he received reflected the serious nature of his crimes, but it also meant that my parents lived, with the constant awareness that someday he would be released and might attempt to contact our family again. After learning the truth about that photograph and the terrifying months of our unknowing cohabitation with a disturbed intruder, I struggled to reconcile this new information with my childhood memories. Every innocent moment from that period was now tainted with the knowledge that we had been under constant surveillance by someone whose intentions toward our family remained frighteningly unclear even after his arrest and conviction. My mother explained that in the years following the trial, she and my father had worked with therapists to process their own trauma while trying to create a sense of safety and normalcy for me. They made the difficult decision never to tell me what had happened, hoping that my young age had protected me from forming lasting memories of the more disturbing aspects of that time period. They sold our house within 6 months of the intruder's arrest, unable to continue living in a space that had been so thoroughly violated. The new house they chose was in a different school district, which explained the sudden move that had confused me as a child. I had always been told that my father's job required the relocation, but now I understood that my parents had been desperately trying to put distance between our family and the sight of such a profound invasion of our privacy and security. The most disturbing aspect of my mother's revelation was learning about the ongoing impact this experience had on my parents' relationship with each other and their approach to parenting me. They became hyper-vigilant about home security, installing alarm systems and security cameras that seemed excessive for our quiet suburban neighborhood. They were reluctant to leave me with babysitters and insisted on personally driving me to and from school activities rather than allowing me to walk or ride with friends. Behaviors I had interpreted as overprotective parenting now made perfect sense in the context of what they had experienced. They weren't trying to limit my independence arbitrarily. They were operating from a place of deep trauma, having learned that threats could emerge from the most unlikely places and that their ability to protect their child could be compromised in ways they had never imagined possible. My mother showed me documentation from the trial that she had kept locked away for all these years. Reading through police reports and testimony transcripts, I began to understand the full scope of what our family had endured. The intruder had been taking detailed notes about my school performance, my friendships, even my favorite foods and television shows. He had somehow gained access to personal information that suggested he had been monitoring not just our household activities, but our communications and possibly even following us outside our home. The realization that someone had been studying my childhood development with such methodical attention made me feel violated in ways I couldn't fully articulate. Every memory from that time period was now suspect, tainted by the knowledge that private family moments had been observed and documented by someone whose motivations remained disturbingly unclear even after extensive psychological evaluation. Haunted me most was learning that some of my clearest childhood memories from that period might have been influenced by his presence in ways I was only beginning to understand. The psychological impact of learning about my unwitting childhood. Cohabitation with a disturbed intruder began manifesting in unexpected ways over the following weeks. I found myself scrutinizing every childhood memory, trying to identify moments when I might have unconsciously sensed his presence without understanding what I was experiencing. Sleep became difficult as I replayed scenarios in my mind, wondering how many times he had watched me during vulnerable moments when I believed I was safe and alone. My mother arranged for me to meet with Dr. Patricia Hendricks, a therapist who specialized in helping families process delayed trauma disclosure. During our sessions, Dr. Hendricks explained that children often have an intuitive awareness of danger that manifests in ways adults might dismiss as imagination or behavioral problems. Many of my childhood anxieties, sleep difficulties, and persistent feelings of being watched were likely accurate perceptions that my young mind couldn't properly contextualize or communicate. Through therapy, I began connecting patterns between my childhood behaviors and the reality of our situation that my parents had hidden from me. My reluctance to sleep alone, my insistence on keeping my bedroom door open, and my frequent nightmares about dark figures in our house weren't signs of an overactive imagination. They were appropriate responses to a genuine threat that the adults in my life were trying to handle without alarming me. Dr. Hendricks helped me understand that my parents' decision to conceal the truth had been motivated by love and a desire to protect my psychological development during a crucial period. However, she also acknowledged that carrying family secrets, even unknowingly, could have subtle but significant impacts on a person's ability to trust their own perceptions and instincts about danger and safety. The therapy sessions revealed that I had developed hypervigilance as a child, constantly scanning my environment for potential threats without understanding why I felt the need to do so. This tendency had persisted into adulthood, manifesting as difficulty relaxing in my own home, reluctance to live alone, and an almost compulsive need to check locks and security systems multiple times before going to bed. Understanding the source of these behaviors was both liberating and disturbing. I finally had explanations for anxiety patterns that had puzzled me for years, but I also had to confront the reality that a stranger's invasion of our family had shaped fundamental aspects of my personality and my relationship with the concept of home as a safe space. My relationship with my parents also underwent a significant shift as I processed this new information. While I understood and appreciated their efforts to protect me, I struggled with feelings of betrayal about the secret they had kept for so long. Part of me wondered what other aspects of my childhood might not have been what they seemed, whether there were other family secrets that had influenced my development without my knowledge. The photograph that had started this revelation remained on my kitchen table, and I found myself staring at it frequently, trying to discern additional details that might provide more insight into that terrifying period of our lives. As weeks passed, I became increasingly obsessed with uncovering more details about our unwanted houseguest and his impact on our family's life. Against my mother's wishes, I contacted the detective who had handled our case, hoping to learn more about the investigation and whether there were aspects of the story that my parents hadn't shared with me. Detective Ray Morrison was now retired, but agreed to meet with me at a coffee shop near the police station where he had worked for 32 years. Detective Morrison remembered our case clearly, describing it as one of the most unusual and disturbing incidents he had encountered during his career. He confirmed many of the details my mother had shared, but also revealed information that painted an even more chilling picture of our months-long cohabitation with someone whose mental state and intentions had been far more dangerous than my parents had realized at the time. The investigation had revealed that our intruder possessed an extensive collection of surveillance equipment, suggesting that his monitoring of our family had been far more sophisticated than simple observation. Through windows or doorways, he had installed tiny cameras in several rooms of our house, devices so small and well concealed that even the police had difficulty locating them during their initial search of the premises. Most disturbing was Detective Morrison's revelation that the intruder had been making audio recordings of our family's private conversations, compiling what amounted to an unauthorized documentary of our daily lives. These recordings had captured intimate moments between my parents' personal phone, calls, and even my private conversations with imaginary friends and stuffed animals. The violation felt so profound that I struggled to process the implications for my childhood sense of privacy and security. The detective explained that the suspect's psychological evaluation had identified him as someone with a rare form of delusional disorder that manifested as an obsessive need to insert himself into other people's family structures. His previous victims had reported similar patterns of behavior, but our family's case was unique in both the duration of his residence in our home and the level of detailed surveillance he had conducted. What made Detective Morrison's revelations even more unsettling was his admission that the police had never been entirely certain they had discovered all of the intruder's hiding places within our house. The structure of our home, with its complex ventilation system and numerous crawl spaces, had provided countless opportunities for concealment that might not have been thoroughly explored during the investigation. This possibility haunted me as I realized that there might have been evidence of his presence that remained undiscovered when my parents sold the house. Future residents might have eventually found remnants of his makeshift living spaces, personal belongings, or surveillance equipment that could have provided additional insight into the scope of his invasion of our privacy. Detective Morrison also shared that the case had influenced his approach to similar reports throughout the remainder of his career, making him more attentive to seemingly minor complaints about strange noises, missing items, or feelings of being watched that other officers might have dismissed as imagination or anxiety. The more I learned about the intruder's methods and the extent of his surveillance, the more I realized that my childhood experiences had been fundamentally different from what I had believed for decades. Every private moment, every personal conversation, every vulnerable instance of childhood development had been observed and documented by someone whose presence in our lives remained a source of profound psychological violation even years after his removal and imprisonment. I decided to visit our old house, despite my mother's strong objections and Dr. Hendricks' concerns about the potential psychological impact of returning to the site of such trauma. The current owners, the Johnson family, were surprised by my request, but graciously allowed me to walk through the property after I explained my connection to the house and my need to process childhood memories in their original context. Standing in my former bedroom, I tried to imagine how different my experience of that space would have been if I had known that someone was frequently hiding in the crawl space above my ceiling, watching me sleep, play, and go about the private activities of childhood. The room felt smaller than I remembered, and I found myself looking up at the ceiling with a new awareness of the hidden spaces that had provided access for our unwanted observer. The Johnson family mentioned that they had discovered some unusual modifications to the house during renovations they had undertaken shortly after purchasing the property. Hidden panels in the basement walls, small holes drilled between rooms, and an unexplained electrical line that didn't connect to any legitimate household systems. These discoveries had puzzled them at the time, but my explanation of our family's history with the house provided context that made these anomalies suddenly and disturbingly understandable. Mrs. Johnson showed me photographs of some of the modifications they had found and removed during their renovation project. Seeing these images provided concrete evidence of how extensively the intruder had altered our living space to facilitate his surveillance and movement throughout the house. The scope of his modifications suggested a level of planning and commitment that went far beyond impulsive Trespassing, he had been preparing to make our house his permanent home. Regardless of our family's consent or awareness, the visit to my childhood home was emotionally overwhelming, but it also provided a sense of closure that I hadn't anticipated. Seeing the house occupied by a happy family who had transformed the space into something positive helped me begin to separate my traumatic associations with the building from the structure itself. The Johnson children were playing in the backyard, where that fateful photograph had been taken, their laughter replacing the sinister memories that had haunted that space in my mind. As I prepared to leave, Mr. Johnson mentioned that they had occasionally found items in the walls during their renovation that seemed too old to have belonged to previous owners. Small personal belongings, photographs, and handwritten notes that they had assumed were forgotten possessions from decades past. My description of our family's experience made them realize that these items might have belonged to our intruder. Hidden caches of personal belongings that had remained concealed for years after his arrest. The possibility that remnants of the intruder's presence might still exist within the walls of my childhood home led to an unexpected development when Mr. Johnson contacted me a few days after my visit. During a weekend project to update the electrical system in their basement, the Johnson family had discovered a small hidden compartment behind a false panel that contained items clearly connected to our family's ordeal from decades earlier. The hidden cache included dozens of photographs of our family that had been taken without our knowledge, detailed hand-drawn maps of our house's interior layout, and most disturbing of all, a journal that documented the intruder's daily observations of our family's routines and behaviors. Mr. Johnson had immediately contacted the police, and Detective Morrison, despite his retirement, had volunteered to examine the newly discovered evidence. When I met with Detective Morrison to review these materials, I was unprepared for the emotional impact of seeing my childhood documented from the perspective of someone who had been watching me with such methodical attention to detail. The journal entries revealed that he had been studying my school performance, my friendship patterns, even my favorite toys and books, compiling information that painted an unnervingly complete picture of my 7-year-old personality and daily activities. What made the journal entries particularly disturbing was the tone of familiarity and affection with which he wrote about our family members. He referred to my parents by their first names and wrote about me as if I were his own child, describing pride in my accomplishments and concern for my well-being that felt grotesquely inappropriate given the circumstances of his surveillance. Some entries revealed that he had been interfering with our lives in subtle ways that we had never detected. He admitted to occasionally moving my toys to different locations while I slept, hiding items that he thought were inappropriate for a child my age, and even leaving small gifts in places where I would find them but wouldn't connect them to an outside source. These revelations helped explain several childhood memories that had always puzzled me, toys appearing in unexpected places. Small items like interesting rocks or pretty leaves showing up in my room without explanation, and the persistent feeling that someone had been rearranging my belongings while I was at school. What I had attributed to forgetfulness or my own absent-minded behavior had actually been evidence of ongoing manipulation by someone who was living in our house and had access to my private spaces. Detective Morrison pointed out that the newly discovered evidence might have implications for the intruder's original conviction, potentially providing grounds for additional charges or extending his sentence if he was still incarcerated. However, he also warned that pursuing legal action based on this new evidence would require me to testify about the impact of these discoveries, forcing me to publicly relive trauma that my parents had worked so hard to help me avoid. The decision about whether to pursue additional legal action created tension within our family, as my parents worried about the psychological cost of extended court proceedings, while I struggled with questions about justice and closure that I couldn't easily resolve through therapy alone. The internal conflict about how to handle the newly discovered evidence intensified when I learned that the intruder was scheduled for release from prison within the next 18 months. His sentence for the original charges was nearing completion, and without additional convictions based on the new evidence, he would soon be free to potentially resume the pattern of behavior that had terrorized our family and others. This realization forced me to confront questions about personal safety and responsibility that I had never anticipated having to address. Detective Morrison explained that restraining orders and other protective measures could provide some legal protection, but they would be difficult to enforce against someone who had demonstrated such sophisticated abilities to infiltrate private spaces without detection. My parents were divided about the best course of action. My mother wanted to pursue additional charges aggressively, believing that the new evidence demonstrated an even higher level of criminal behavior that warranted extended incarceration. My father was more concerned about the psychological impact that prolonged legal proceedings might have on our family, particularly given the media attention that such an unusual case might attract. Dr. Hendricks helped me work through the competing considerations involved in this decision, emphasizing that there was no objectively correct choice and that I needed to prioritize my own emotional well-being, while also considering the broader implications for public safety. The therapy sessions during this period focused heavily on helping me develop confidence in my own judgment and my ability to trust my instincts about risk and safety. The process of deciding whether to pursue additional legal action also led to conversations with other victims of similar crimes, people whose families had experienced comparable invasions of privacy and security. Connecting with these individuals provided perspective on the long-term psychological impact of such experiences and the various approaches that different families had taken to achieve healing and closure. One conversation particularly influenced my thinking. A woman named Linda, whose family had experienced a similar intruder situation when she was a teenager. She described the relief she felt after testifying in court about the impact of the crimes, explaining that speaking publicly about her experience had helped her reclaim a sense of agency and control that the intruder's surveillance had undermined. However, Linda also warned me about the potential costs of legal proceedings, describing how media coverage of her family's case had attracted unwanted attention and forced them to relive traumatic experiences in very public ways. She emphasized that the decision to pursue additional charges was deeply personal and that there was no universal right answer that would work for every family in similar circumstances. After weeks of consideration and consultation with family members, therapists, and legal advisors, I decided to cooperate with the prosecution's efforts to file additional charges based on the newly discovered evidence, while also working with victim advocacy organizations to minimize media coverage and protect our family's privacy during the legal process. The decision to pursue additional criminal charges based on the newly discovered evidence initiated a complex legal process that would extend over the following year. The prosecutor assigned to our case explained that the journal entries and photographs found in the hidden compartment provided compelling evidence of charges that hadn't been filed during the original prosecution, including additional counts of surveillance, stalking, and invasion of privacy. However, the legal proceedings also required me to engage with aspects of the case that my parents had protected me from during the original trial. I had to review police reports, surveillance footage, and evidence that painted a comprehensive picture of how thoroughly our family's privacy had been violated during those months when we unknowingly shared our home with someone whose intentions remained disturbing and unclear even years later. The psychological preparation for testifying proved more challenging than I had anticipated. Despite years of therapy and an intellectual understanding of what had occurred, confronting the detailed evidence of surveillance and intrusion triggered anxiety responses that I hadn't experienced since childhood. Dr. Hendricks worked with me intensively during this period to develop coping strategies that would allow me to participate in the legal proceedings without being re-traumatized by the process. One unexpected aspect of preparing for trial was the opportunity to meet with forensic psychologists who had evaluated the intruder during his original sentencing. Their insights into his psychological profile helped me understand that his behavior toward our family hadn't been random or impersonal. He had selected us based on specific criteria that matched his delusional ideal of family life, and his observations of our household dynamics had reinforced his belief that he belonged in our lives. The forensic evaluation revealed that he had been diagnosed with several mental health conditions that, while not excusing his behavior, provided context for understanding the persistence and sophistication of his intrusion into our lives. His psychological profile suggested someone whose boundary violations would likely escalate over time if left untreated, making the question of his impending release even more concerning for our family's future safety. As the trial date approached, I struggled with conflicting emotions about confronting the person who had invaded our family's privacy so profoundly during my childhood. Part of me wanted to see him face to face, to understand what kind of person could engage in such behavior and perhaps gain closure through direct confrontation. Another part of me dreaded being in the same room with someone who had watched me sleep, documented my childhood development, and violated my family's sense of security so completely. My parents' own preparation for the trial involved revisiting traumatic memories they had worked for years to process and move beyond. The additional legal proceedings forced them to relive the fear, helplessness, and violation they had experienced during those months when they knew someone was living in our house but felt powerless to protect their family without potentially escalating a dangerous situation. The media attention surrounding our case was more extensive than any of us had anticipated. Despite efforts by victim advocates to maintain our privacy during the legal proceedings, the trial began on a cold Monday morning in February, and walking into the courthouse, I felt the weight of decades of family secrets and trauma culminating in this moment of public reckoning with our past. The prosecutor had prepared me for the likelihood that media coverage would attract attention to our case, but I was still unprepared for the number of reporters and curious observers who had gathered to witness testimony about such an unusual and disturbing crime. Seeing the defendant in person for the first time was surreal and disturbing in ways I hadn't anticipated. He appeared older and more fragile than I had expected, but there was something in his expression when he looked at our family that suggested his obsessions and delusions remained intact despite years of incarceration and presumably therapeutic intervention. My testimony focused on the impact that learning about his surveillance had on my adult understanding of my childhood experiences and my ongoing struggles with anxiety and trust issues that could be traced directly to his violation of our family's privacy and security. Speaking publicly about these experiences felt both empowering and exposing, giving me an opportunity to reclaim some control over a narrative that had shaped my life without my knowledge for so many years. The prosecutor presented evidence from the hidden cache that painted a comprehensive picture of surveillance and intrusion that went far beyond what had been established during the original trial. The journal entries, photographs, and personal belongings found in the walls of our former home demonstrated a level of obsession and planning that supported additional charges and potentially extended incarceration. During cross-examination, the defense attorney attempted to characterize the defendant's behavior as the result of mental illness rather than criminal intent, arguing that his actions had been motivated by delusional beliefs rather than malicious intent to harm our family. While I understood the legal strategy, hearing his invasion of our privacy described in clinical terms that minimized the impact on our lives was frustrating and emotionally difficult, taught my parents. Testimony provided context about the fear and helplessness they had experienced during the months when they knew someone was living in our house but felt unable to protect their family without potentially escalating a dangerous situation. Their description of the psychological toll this experience had taken on their relationship with each other and their approach to parenting helped the jury understand the far-reaching consequences of the defendant's actions. The most compelling evidence presented during the trial came from technical experts who analyzed the modifications the defendant had made to our house to facilitate his surveillance and movement. Their testimony revealed the sophisticated planning and commitment required to carry out such extensive invasion of privacy, contradicting defense arguments that his behavior had been impulsive or disorganized. Expert witnesses in forensic psychology provided testimony about the likelihood of recidivism in cases involving this type of delusional behavior, explaining to the jury that without intensive ongoing treatment and supervision, individuals with similar psychological profiles typically continue to engage in boundary violations and stalking behaviors. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning with guilty verdicts on all additional charges, resulting in an extended sentence that would keep the defendant incarcerated for at least another decade beyond his original release date. Relief I felt upon hearing the verdict was complicated by the knowledge that legal resolution couldn't undo the psychological impact that his invasion of our family had created, nor could it guarantee that similar threats wouldn't emerge in the future following the trial. Our family entered a period of adjustment as we processed the experience of public testimony and attempted to move forward with our lives while incorporating the new understanding of our shared history that the legal proceedings had forced us to confront. The media coverage of our case gradually diminished, but the experience of having our family's trauma become part of public record created lasting changes in how we approach privacy and personal security. Dr. Hendricks continued working with me to process the complex emotions that arose from finally confronting the person who had violated our family's safety so profoundly during my childhood. While the trial had provided a sense of justice and closure, it had also reinforced the reality that some forms of trauma create lasting changes in how we experience safety and trust that persist, regardless of legal resolution or therapeutic intervention. The months following the trial brought unexpected challenges as I struggled to readjust to daily life after spending so much emotional energy focused on legal proceedings and confronting traumatic memories. The hypervigilance that had characterized my childhood returned with intensity, making it difficult to relax in my own home or feel secure in private spaces that should have provided comfort and refuge. My relationship with my parents evolved significantly during this period as we worked together to process shared trauma that we had never previously acknowledged or discussed openly. The family therapy sessions that Dr. Hendricks recommended helped us develop new patterns of communication about difficult topics and create strategies for supporting each other through ongoing psychological recovery. One unexpected consequence of the trial was the contact I received from other families who had experienced similar invasions of privacy and security. Learning about the prevalence of this type of crime and connecting with other survivors provided perspective on my own experience while also highlighting the inadequacy of existing legal and therapeutic resources for addressing such complex trauma. These connections, I became involved in advocacy efforts aimed at improving law enforcement training for investigating cases involving covert surveillance and home invasion, as well as supporting legislation that would strengthen penalties for crimes that involve extended stalking and privacy violations. This advocacy work provided a sense of purpose that helped transform my traumatic experience into something that might prevent other families from enduring similar violations. The photograph that had initiated this journey of discovery remained on my kitchen table for months after the trial, serving as a daily reminder of how much of my childhood experience had been shaped by circumstances I couldn't have understood at the time. Eventually, I decided to frame the image alongside a recent family photograph, creating a visual representation of my family's resilience and our ability to rebuild trust and security despite the profound violations we had experienced. 2 years after the trial concluded, I found myself in a place of unexpected healing and growth that I couldn't have imagined during the darkest periods of confronting my family's traumatic history. The advocacy work I had become involved in had evolved into a more formal role with a nonprofit organization focused on supporting families affected by stalking and covert surveillance, providing me with opportunities to transform my personal experience into meaningful assistance for others facing similar challenges. Working with other survivors taught me that recovery from this type of trauma rarely follows predictable patterns or timelines. Some individuals experience immediate relief after legal resolution, while others struggle for years with anxiety and trust issues that persist long after the immediate threat has been eliminated. Learning to accept my own nonlinear healing process became an important part of my ongoing psychological recovery. My parents and I developed new family traditions that emphasize security, openness, and mutual support, while acknowledging the ways that our shared trauma had permanently changed our relationships with each other and our understanding of home as a safe space. We began taking annual family trips to locations that held positive memories, creating new experiences that could coexist with our difficult history without being overshadowed by it. The relationship I developed with Detective Morrison evolved into an ongoing friendship that provided unique insight into the investigative process and helped me understand the broader context of crimes involving home invasion and surveillance. His perspective as a law enforcement professional who had handled numerous similar cases helped me recognize that while our family's experience had been deeply personal and traumatic, we were part of a larger pattern of criminal behavior that affected many families across the country. Through my advocacy work, I learned about advances in home security, technology, and legal protections that weren't available during the time period when our family was victimized. While these developments couldn't undo our past experiences, they provided hope that future families might have better resources for detecting and responding to similar threats before they escalate to the level of violation that we had endured. Johnson family, who had discovered the hidden cache of evidence in our former house, became unexpected allies in my healing process. Their willingness to support the legal proceedings and their transformation of the house into a space associated with positive family memories helped me develop a healthier relationship with the physical location where so much trauma had occurred. Dr. Hendricks gradually reduced the frequency of our therapy sessions as I demonstrated increased stability and confidence in managing anxiety symptoms and trust issues that had persisted since childhood. However, she emphasized that ongoing professional support would remain available whenever I needed assistance processing new challenges or setbacks in my recovery process. The hypervigilance that had characterized much of my adult life began to diminish as I developed more sophisticated understanding of genuine security threats versus anxiety responses triggered by traumatic memories. Learning to distinguish between reasonable caution and trauma-driven fear became an important milestone in my psychological recovery. The 5th anniversary of discovering that childhood photograph marked a significant milestone in my family's journey toward healing and integration of our traumatic experiences into a broader narrative of resilience and growth. The date had initially felt overwhelming, a reminder of how profoundly that single image had disrupted my understanding of my childhood and my family's history. But it gradually became an opportunity to reflect on the positive changes that had emerged from confronting such difficult truths. My advocacy work had expanded to include consulting with law enforcement agencies on improving their response protocols for cases involving covert surveillance and long-term stalking behaviors. Training sessions I conducted for police departments emphasized the importance of taking seemingly minor complaints about strange noises, missing items, or feelings of being watched seriously, as these reports often represent early indicators of more serious crimes in progress. The nonprofit organization I worked with had secured funding to develop educational materials for families about recognizing signs of covert surveillance and home invasion, as well as resources for supporting children who might be experiencing trauma related to violations of their home environment. Creating these materials required me to revisit many aspects of my own childhood experience, but the process had become less emotionally destabilizing as I developed stronger coping strategies and a clearer sense of purpose around my advocacy efforts. My relationship with my parents continued to evolve as we maintained open communication about our shared trauma while also working to build new, positive experiences together that weren't overshadowed by our difficult history. Family gatherings became opportunities to celebrate our resilience and mutual support rather than occasions marked by unspoken anxiety about past violations of our security and privacy. The legal system's handling of our case had established important precedents for prosecuting crimes involving extended covert surveillance, and I had been asked to provide testimony for legislative committees considering strengthening penalties for stalking behaviors that involve infiltration of private residences. These opportunities to influence policy and legal protections for other families provided a sense of meaningful purpose that helped transform my traumatic experience into something that could benefit others facing similar challenges. Detective Morrison had become a mentor figure in my advocacy work, sharing insights from his law enforcement experience, while supporting my efforts to improve system responses to crimes involving home invasion and surveillance. His perspective helped me understand that while our family's case had been unusual in its duration and sophistication, the underlying patterns of behavior were more common than many people realized, making education and awareness efforts critically important for public safety. The photograph that had initiated this journey remained displayed in my home, but its meaning had transformed from a source of trauma and anxiety into a symbol of my family's strength and our ability to confront difficult truths while maintaining our connections to each other. The image no longer triggered overwhelming emotional responses, but instead served as a reminder of how much growth and healing had occurred since that shocking moment of discovery in my grandmother's attic. As I write these final thoughts, nearly 6 years have passed since I found that photograph hidden in my grandmother's attic, and I can honestly say that the journey from discovery to healing has been more complex and transformative than I ever could have imagined. The terrifying secret that image revealed about my childhood has become integrated into my life story in ways that honor both the trauma we experienced and the resilience that carried our family through recovery and growth. The defendant remains incarcerated, and while his eventual release still represents a source of concern for a family's ongoing security, the extended sentence resulting from the additional charges has provided time for us to establish strong support systems and safety protocols. Regular communication with victim services ensures that we will receive advance notification of any changes in his legal status, and our family has developed comprehensive security measures that provide both practical protection and psychological reassurance. My career in victim advocacy has become a source of profound personal satisfaction. allowing me to transform the most traumatic experience of my childhood into meaningful assistance for other families facing similar violations. The organization one work with has helped hundreds of families navigate the complex legal, psychological, and practical challenges associated with covert surveillance and stalking crimes. And knowing that my experience contributes to preventing others from feeling as helpless as my family once did provides ongoing motivation for this difficult but important work. The relationship between my parents and me has been fundamentally strengthened by our shared journey through trauma recovery and legal proceedings. The family secrets that once created distance and confusion have been replaced by open communication and mutual support that allows us to address new challenges with confidence in our ability to face difficult situations together while maintaining our individual well-being and autonomy. Looking back at that 7-year-old child in the photograph, I feel profound compassion for the little girl who was experiencing genuine danger that she couldn't understand or articulate. The hypervigilance and anxiety that characterized my childhood were appropriate responses to real threats. And learning to trust my own perceptions and instincts has been one of the most important outcomes of this entire experience. The hidden figure in that childhood photograph no longer represents just terror and violation. It has become a symbol of survival, resilience, and the possibility of transforming even the most traumatic experiences into sources of strength and purpose. While I would never choose to repeat what our family endured, I have learned that healing doesn't require forgetting or minimizing trauma, but rather finding ways to integrate difficult experiences into a life narrative that includes both suffering and growth. Both vulnerability and strength. My childhood photo did indeed hide a terrifying secret, but discovering that secret ultimately led to greater self-understanding, stronger family relationships, meaningful career purpose, and most importantly, the knowledge that even the most frightening truths can be confronted and survived with the right support, resources, and determination to transform trauma into wisdom and isolation into connection with others who understand similar struggles.